2 bodies were discovered in a small house on the outskirts of the city, those of an 18-year-old man and his 63-year-old grandmother. The woman lay shot through the chest, and her grandson lay next to her with a gunshot wound to the head. Traces of semen were found on the grandmother's hands. DNA testing later revealed that the semen belonged to her grandson. The investigation revealed that behind this tragedy lay not only family secrets and isolation, but also a relationship that had degenerated into a forbidden and deadly addiction. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Baltimore remained one of the most crime-ridden cities in the United States. Murder, robbery, and assault rates consistently exceeded the national average. Most of the crimes were related to street gangs and drug trafficking. Outlying neighborhoods were often the scene of shootings, which occurred during daylight hours and spared no one but bystanders. One such incident involved the family where the future suspect in this case grew up. His parents, mother and father, were returning home one evening when they were attacked by armed criminals. The conflict escalated rapidly. One of the gang members fired several shots, and both parents were killed instantly. According to eyewitnesses, the attack was a simple robbery, but no definitive information about the perpetrators was found. The crime added to the city police's long list of unsolved cases. The teenager, then 14, was left an orphan. The custody issue was urgently resolved. The only close relative willing to take him in was his maternal grandmother. At the time, the woman lived in her home on the outskirts of Baltimore. She was in her 60s, led a modest lifestyle, and was known to her neighbors as a stern but calm woman. After the death of her daughter and son-in-law, she insisted on taking her grandson in. Legally, the arrangements were swift. No social obstacles arose, and the teenager moved in with her. At first, they tried to establish a life together. Neighbors later reported seeing them together at the store, on walks, and that the grandmother and grandson remained close. Given the profound loss, this seemed natural. For the young man, adolescence was complicated by tragedy. The loss of his parents led to isolation and academic difficulties. Teachers noted that he became less sociable and withdrew from his classmates, but he had no significant disciplinary problems. His entire focus shifted to his home life. His grandmother covered all expenses and exercised complete control over his leisure time. During the first years of their marriage, their relationship seemed standard. She cooked, he helped with the housework, and they shared common concerns. But even during this period, the first signs of overprotection emerged. She limited his interactions, preferring him to stay home and avoid spending time with his friends. She saw this as a way to protect her grandson from external danger, considering that street violence had taken the lives of his parents. By the time he turned 18, the young man was effectively under his grandmother's complete control. He was unemployed, had limited contact with peers, and had no romantic relationships. Neighbors noted that he rarely left the house alone and was almost always with her. This was outwardly attributed to family attachment after the tragedy, but it was precisely this withdrawn lifestyle that laid the foundation for subsequent events. Against a backdrop of apparent calm, conditions began to emerge that would later lead to disaster. The loss of his parents and isolation made the young man emotionally dependent on his only close friend. His grandmother, deprived of her daughter, focused all her energy on him, which gradually evolved from care into an obsessive form of control. These changes were initially almost unnoticeable to those around them, but it was here that the seeds of a tragic outcome were laid. Unequal roles in the family, a lack of external support, and a lack of critical insight into what was happening. Gradually, the boundaries between care and pressure began to blur, ultimately leading to the most dire consequences. After moving in with his grandmother, the rhythm of life became fixed in a routine that depended entirely on her decisions. The grandson was named Daniel, and his grandmother was named Evelyn. The first few months coincided with the period when the teenager needed adult support. Evelyn took over this role entirely. She controlled the household, meals, sleep schedule, computer access, contacts, and movements. School attendance records were filled with notes of constant tardiness, explained by Evelyn's insistence on sharing morning routines. Gradually, Daniel's social circle dwindled to a few classmates, then disappeared. Phone calls were intercepted. The grandmother would answer first, clarify the purpose of the call, promise to pass on messages, but never did. Over time, control became the primary tool of interaction. Evelyn demanded a report on every outing: address, time, people, and goals. She kept lists on the refrigerator where she wrote down tasks for Daniel and checked their completion. When he refused to go on outings, approval was recorded. When he asked permission to meet with his peers, a series of questions and comments about the unsafety of the neighborhood followed. Any attempt at independent decision-making was interpreted as a risk. After several such episodes, the requests for meetings ceased. The emotional strain increased and became regular. Evelyn emphasized that home was the only safe place. Against the backdrop of the city's crime statistics, this argument seemed persuasive. Thus arose a fear-based isolation. For Daniel, this meant staying at home all the time and being tied to a single source of support. School reports noted low engagement and loss of interest in classes, but there were no disciplinary violations. A role reversal followed. Evelyn began instituting rituals of shared relaxation, demanding her presence while watching the news, reading, or eating dinner. Any attempt to enter the room was met with comments about ingratitude. As this regimen became entrenched, the touching became regular, extended hugs upon greeting and parting, sitting next to her on the couch, with a requirement not to get up until the end of the program. Formally, these actions could be considered caring, but the duration of contact and persistence distinguished them from normal, maternal grandmotherly behavior. Contact intensified during stressful situations. Evelyn arranged blankets, straightened sleeves, and smoothed Daniel's hair, holding her hands longer than necessary. Comments on his appearance were framed as concerns about his health and fatigue, but accompanied by attentive glances and examinations, uncharacteristic of standard caregiving. Daniel stopped protesting, as any objection would lead to a flare-up of resentment. Then the spatial convergence began. Evelyn explained her refusal of the guest bedroom by saying it gave her the peace of mind of monitoring the silence in the house at night. Daniel's door was left ajar because, according to Evelyn, she needed to hear if he was having trouble sleeping. Over time, she began finding excuses to come in at night, checking the room's temperature, pretending to hear noise outside, needing to close the window or adjust the blanket. These visits became systematic. The next step was an inventory of her personal belongings. Evelyn rearranged items on the table, sorted clothes, and went through her backpack. Order was the key, but any signs of outside contact were also monitored separately. Tickets, receipts, notes, phone numbers. Later, a notebook appeared in the kitchen, containing a table of dates and notes on Daniel's mood and the amount of time he spent with her. At the same time, the number of phone calls decreased. Calls became brief, and Evelyn took the initiative. Around the time he finished school, Daniel stopped applying for part-time jobs. Evelyn explained this by the need to prepare for exams and the dangers of night shifts. Home became his only environment. Amid this isolation, physical contact normalized and became a consistent practice. Daily hugs, sitting close on the sofa, touching his neck and shoulders while reading. Emotional formulas included emphatic references to a special closeness that supposedly compensated for the loss of his parents. The transition to intimate boundary violations occurred without abrupt gestures, but with a steady escalation of intimacy. Evelyn began delaying touching sensitive areas under the pretext of adjusting her clothing or relieving fatigue after housework. Kissing on the lips was observed in situations typically associated with neutral forms of support. One-off incidents were reinforced by repetition. Daniel's objections were met with emotional pressure, statements about his fear of loneliness, and the threat of worsening living conditions. The regime's stability was ensured by the distribution of responsibilities. Daniel was assigned chores that tied him to the house and made his presence with the family mandatory. Any delay became a pretext for resentment and further intimacy under the guise of reconciliation. Social isolation became complete. Friends stopped visiting. The phone was kept on the kitchen shelf, and Evelyn knew the passwords. This created an internal conflict. Daniel felt guilty for wanting to spend time away from home and clearly sensed the strangeness of the new rules, but his dependence on his only relative and fear of scandal prevented him from changing the situation. His sleep became shallow. He felt lethargic in the mornings, and his daytime activity decreased. No medical attention was recorded. A further shift involved the introduction of affection rituals. Evelyn scheduled dinners together and demanded physical intimacy as a sign of loyalty. Contact became regular and occurred at her initiative. Refusals were followed by long periods of silence, after which everything returned to the previous regime with even more intense control. The home environment no longer included Daniel's personal space in its usual form. The door to his room was often left open, computer time was reduced, and headphones were discouraged. By this point, the boundaries had become completely blurred. Evelyn reacted jealously to any mention of girls from school, interpreting them as a threat to stability. Daniel's schedule coincided with hers. Shared meals, watching the news together, cleaning together, and spending evenings together without any alternatives. On paper, it looked like family support, but in reality, it was a system of isolation and reinforcing dependence. During the rare periods when Daniel would plan to leave the house for a few hours, arguments about the unsafe neighborhood and memories of his parents' deaths would surface. This would suppress his initiative and return the pattern to its original point. Evelyn would intensify physical contact as a finishing touch, holding hands, holding them in embraces longer than reasonable, kissing without asking for consent. There were no obstacles to continuing these episodes, as there were no third parties in the house, and the outside world was excluded from his life. The material traces of the process included time-stamped notebooks, to-do lists, notes on the refrigerator, rearranged furniture to control visibility, regular nighttime visits, and a systematic reduction in distance. These markers indicated a consistent deformation of the family role and the entrenchment of intimate practices under the guise of protection and care. By the end of the period described, the behavioral dynamics stabilized in a state of complete dependence. Evelyn demanded constant presence and physical intimacy as a condition of domestic peace, while Daniel lost external connections and stable plans for the future. Personal boundaries were eliminated, and alternative behavioral scenarios were absent. This state preceded further escalation, in which intimate episodes ceased to be an exception and became central to the daily routine. By the age of 18, Daniel found himself in a situation of complete isolation. His contact with his peers ceased, his studies were minimal, and plans for further education were not even considered. Evelyn filled every aspect of his existence, creating a closed circle in which she remained the only significant person. The first changes manifested themselves in heightened jealousy toward attempts at socializing outside the home. Any mention of girls he knew provoked an aggressive reaction. This was followed by lengthy monologues about ingratitude and the risk of a repeat of his parents' death. This reasoning reinforced Daniel's feelings of guilt. Gradually, he stopped mentioning girls, but his grandmother began initiating conversations, emphasizing that she was the one capable of providing his full attention and support. Over time, physical contact intensified. Whereas previously it had been hugs and kisses on the cheek, Evelyn now began to touch without any justification for everyday grooming. There were instances where she would rest her hands on her hips or run her palm over her body, under the pretext of checking the condition of her clothes or fatigue. Later, such actions no longer required pretext and began to be performed directly. At the same time, the space in the house changed. Evelyn rearranged the furniture so that Daniel's bed was within her direct line of sight upon entering. Nighttime visits became more frequent. At first, they were explained as a concern for sleep, then they evolved into mandatory checkups. Daniel was in a constant state of surveillance, feeling as if every movement was being recorded. The key turning point was kissing on the lips, which became a regular part of their interaction. It was accompanied by a demand not to push her away. Daniel's internal resistance was accompanied by suppressed guilt and fear. The threat of losing his only home intensified his dependence. Evelyn conveyed the idea of a special bond that transcended standard family norms. Gradually, the transition to intimate gestures became systematic. She kept her hands on his chest, touched him in the groin, and finally achieved a state of complete intimacy. These actions were recorded as stages of increasing intimacy. There were no outside witnesses. Everything took place in the confined space of the home. Daniel increasingly showed signs of depression, loss of appetite, withdrawal, and apathy. However, the lack of alternative support made it impossible to break off the relationship. He couldn't turn to the police or social services, fearing it would lead to a complete loss of stability. Evelyn, however, reinforced the pattern through repetition, turning intimate episodes into a routine. At this stage, boundaries disappeared completely. Home ceased to be a safe space and became a place of imposed dependence. Sexualized contacts became constant, and any resistance was accompanied by psychological pressure and emotional manipulation. Thus, By the end of the third stage, the situation had become stable. Evelyn had consolidated her power. Daniel found himself in a subordinate position, and external factors had ceased to exert influence. From this point on, further developments could only proceed along the path of increasing pressure and eventual escalation. By the time this new stage arrived, the home had completely transformed into a closed system where familiar boundaries had disappeared. Evelyn controlled every aspect of Daniel's life, turning intimate moments into a mandatory part of the daily routine. Habitual forms of care ceased to exist. Every interaction was accompanied by physical contact, which became the norm. The episodes occurred regularly and weren't limited to the evenings. Mornings began with touching that cemented power. Throughout the day, Evelyn demanded intimacy while cooking, cleaning, and relaxing. Sexual behavior became part of the routine and wasn't considered an exception. Daniel perceived this as inevitable, although feelings of humiliation and shame lingered within. Along with this, social isolation intensified. The phone was no longer used even for occasional calls. All financial resources were under Evelyn's control. She didn't allow him to plan his own actions, limiting his every move. External life disappeared. Neighbors continued to believe they were leading a quiet life, as the house looked well kept and their grandson rarely appeared outside. Daniel's psychological state began to deteriorate. Signs of depression were observed: sleepless nights, loss of interest in food, and withdrawal. His existence was limited to the role of a subordinate, forced to comply with demands that contradicted his inner convictions. No attempts at resistance were recorded. Every objection previously resulted in a confrontation and subsequent escalation of pressure. Evelyn, on the other hand, acted as if their relationship had acquired a new, stable format. She arranged dinners together with emphatic displays of intimacy, reacted jealously to any hints about the outside world, and insisted that Daniel belonged exclusively to her. Any sign of distance was perceived as a betrayal. Over time, regular contact became the primary means of containment. Daniel had no internal resources or external support left. Each day became a repeat of the previous one, with no prospect of escape. The pressure reached a level at which his psyche could no longer cope. Internal rebellion transformed into a desperate desire to end the situation by any means necessary. This stage finally solidified the pattern of dependence and became the harbinger of a tragic outcome. The situation entered a phase where the destruction of personality was accompanied by constant pressure for intimate contact, and tension reached a critical point. The final stage of events arrived suddenly, although its signs had been accumulating gradually. The house where Evelyn and Daniel lived had become a closed environment, where every detail was subject to a system of total control. Daniel had no external support, which increased the internal pressure. Attempts to leave or even distance himself were perceived as a threat. Gradually, the situation reached a fever pitch. By this time, his psyche was in a state of debilitation. Symptoms of depression included insomnia, severe mood swings, and refusal to eat. Every little thing became a catalyst for tension. Evelyn continued to impose a model of intimacy that viewed intimate contact as the natural form of their relationship. The lack of alternatives perpetuated the feeling of hopelessness. Daniel began to display irritability and outbursts of aggression in everyday situations. He reacted more harshly to requests, slammed doors, and retreated to his room. But isolation brought no relief. The internal tension only intensified. Attempts to find a way out of this isolated situation were met with the realization of complete dependence. Even thoughts of escape seemed unrealistic. A lack of money, housing, and support made this option unavailable. Evelyn didn't notice the destructive effect. On the contrary, her behavior became increasingly obsessive. She demanded constant presence, emphasized her central role in his life, and reacted with jealousy to any attempts at distancing. Every morning began under her supervision. Every evening ended with imposed closeness. The atmosphere in the house reached a point of extreme tension. Eventually, during another conflict, Daniel concluded that the situation had no resolution. In the house was an old firearm, once belonging to his father, which for him symbolized an ultimate escape from the circumstances he saw as unbearable. That night, a violent incident took place. Evelyn received a gunshot injury while in the living room where they usually spent their evenings. Daniel then used the weapon against himself. Both were later found lifeless inside the house. The following morning, neighbors noticed the absence of activity. Curtains were drawn, and lights remained off. After several hours, they contacted authorities. Responding officers forced entry and confirmed the deaths. There were no signs of outside interference or a prolonged struggle. Investigators seized Evelyn's notebooks, which contained detailed notes about Daniel's daily behavior and activities. These documents supported findings that her involvement had been systematic and extended into nearly every aspect of his life. Expert assessments described Daniel as suffering from severe psychological strain and depressive symptoms. The case was officially classified as a domestic tragedy rooted in emotional dependency and the collapse of personal boundaries.